So Cumbria's suspended acting Chief Constable Stuart Hyde will return to work, but in his substantive post as Deputy Chief Constable. It follows a year suspended on full pay and 2 investigations which cleared him of misconduct. Julie Clayton reminds us what happened.
It was last September when Stuart Hyde was suspended, and an investigation by the Independent Police Complaints Commission found no evidence of serious misconduct. Then South Wales Police began an investigation which earlier this summer found no evidence of criminality, but did make 36 recommendations. Cumbria's Police and Crime Commissioner Richard Rhodes then said he felt that there were still questions to be answered and would like Stuart Hyde to resign or retire. But with his role as temporary Chief Constable coming to an end, and as Deputy Chief Constable falling outside Mr Rhodes' remit, it was up to the current temporary Chief Constable Bernard Lawson to decide what to do. Mr Lawson says some of Mr Hyde's behaviour did fall short of what should be expected, but he'll be back at his desk next Monday. Mr Hyde says he will retire at the end of the year.
Earlier today, the current temporary Chief Constable Bernard Lawson explained what would happen next.
Having very carefully considered the findings of the Independent Executive Summary, I have concluded that whilst Mr Hyde's behaviour did fall short of what the police service and the public should demand from a senior public servant, I do believe that in his role as Deputy Chief Constable, Mr Hyde should return to work, albeit under a detailed plan to ensure lessons are learnt from what has been identified during the investigation. Mr Hyde has agreed that he has learnt a great deal from the experience and accepts the recommended management advice. Mr Hyde will have a managed return to the constabulary on the 9th of September at Carlton Hall, where he will initially be responsible for a range of strategic IT developments for the force for which he is nationally recognised. He has indicated his intention to retire with effect from December the 31st this year.
Well, in the studio with me now is Richard Rhodes, the Police and Crime Commissioner. Richard Rhodes, you've had some tough decisions to make these last few weeks. Just talk me through why you decided Stuart Hyde isn't capable of being the Chief Constable.
I'm not saying he isn't capable. I'm saying that, on reflection, as a result of some of his behaviour, it's inappropriate for him to continue in the office of Chief Constable.
But it's okay for him to be Deputy Chief Constable?
The two are totally different, yes. In answer to your question, yes. The two are totally different. The events of last week all related to Mr Hyde as temporary Chief Constable, over which the Police and Crime Commissioner, of course, has some, authority is the wrong word, but to whom the temporary Chief Constable is answerable to the Police and Crime Commissioner. As Deputy Chief Constable, the person who is in charge is the Chief Constable. So we're talking about two very different roles, and as a result, and that's the big difference between last week and what has happened today.
2 investigations with 8 or 9 officers dedicated to the case researched whether or not there was evidence of misconduct when it comes to Stuart Hyde's behaviour. Both investigations cleared Mr Hyde of criminality. Why did you bother having those investigations if you weren't going to follow or adhere to their outcomes?
The first thing is that the reason why you have a report of this nature is for the benefit of the Police and Crime Commissioner, so that he or she can make a decision. That's what the report is about. It's not actually a document really meant for the public, though of course the public can have access to it. But the real point is that it gives the Police and Crime Commissioner the necessary information. Now, you referred to the 2 investigations. The IPCC investigation was last September. It was a prima facie investigation. There was no major factual content compared with the present time. So their decision was made on completely different grounds from any decision which I made.
So it was pointless?
No, I don't think it was pointless at all, because the police authority clearly wanted, in a sense, some support and some backup for their decision to suspend Mr Hyde in the first place. And it was quite proper that they should refer it to the IPCC.
Which is the process. But then you passed on the details to South Wales Police.
No, I didn't. The police authority passed on the details to the South Wales Police.
But again, in order to gain information for your office.
Well, yes, correct, as it turns out, because obviously when I was elected in November, I took up the mantle, as it were, of the whole process. And the investigation from South Wales had started before I was elected. So I then I felt it was important to allow that process to continue.
Was it useful?
I think a lot's been said about how long it's taken and how much money it's cost. It was useful in the sense that once allegations of that kind have been made, then it's right and proper that they should be investigated thoroughly. And unfortunately, that's an expensive exercise because it takes time. I had a conversation with the Chief Constable of South Wales every month because I was required by the legislation to review the suspension every month, and that was done. And you have the dates in the executive survey which we sent out the other day. It was useful, therefore, to go through the process. It was useful to investigate the allegations, and it was useful to see what South Wales Police meant and by way of recommendation. But whether it was useful relative to the total time and the total cost, I don't know. I'm not sure the process is that efficient.
But from what you're saying, neither of those reports had any bearing on your decision-making.
No, that's not true, Emma. That is not true. The South Wales report said simply that Mr. Hyde was not found guilty of any criminality, nor of any gross misconduct or misconduct. When I looked at the report, there were a number of issues which I was unhappy about, in the sense that I didn't really understand why they could not be considered to be misconduct. I then called, as I'm entitled to, for the evidence. And when I saw the evidence, I was quite sure in my mind that there was a case to answer on one, two, three issues.
Why do you think that your opinion, therefore, holds more validity compared to that of the officers that carried out the investigation for South Wales?
I'm not claiming that it has more validity. What I'm saying is that my view of their interpretation of events was different. Now, as Police and Crime Commissioner, one thing I don't have to do is to do everything the police say. That's part of the role. The part of the role is to challenge what the police say. If I can take the guise of member of the public, if I look at the evidence and say to myself, well, I don't think that's quite right, and I see this evidence and I say, no, there are questions to answer, I will do so, and I'm entitled to do so. And actually, I think if the public knew that, it would actually justify my questioning what had been said by the South Wales Police.
For want of a better way of putting this, are you just flexing your muscles?
No. What do you mean by flexing my muscles?
Well, for example, you decided that there was room for concern when it came to Stuart Hyde's use of the force credit card, his expenses, his time spent away from the force, despite these two reports that were made by 8 or 9 different officers saying there was no misconduct. And like you said, you don't have to do what the police tell you to, so you're just flexing your muscles.
Well, I think it's interesting, isn't it? If you look at the Chief Constable's statement today, he passes comment which I claim would support my view.
Well, he says that his management, it fell short of what is expected of somebody in the force. But that doesn't add up to misconduct, does it? That doesn't add up to asking somebody to resign or retire.
Well, from where I sit, actually, if the truth be known, and if you look at all the detail, if people read the small print and see the evidence, I think a lot of people would actually say that it does, or it could do. Now,
what is that small print? Just for the listeners who haven't read the report, what is that small print?
Well, that's the problem. A lot of people are passing judgment on this without having read the report.
But that's the case in any political situation.
So, which is why I'm here today, trying to explain to you the reasons for my action.
So what is in the small print?
Well, the small print is the evidence of the officers in which they say quite clearly that there were areas in which force policy was breached.
But it said that Stuart Hyde needed guidance.
Indeed, yes.
And that's the lowest level of action to be taken on that sort of report, rather than resign or retire or leave the force entirely.
Yes, and I should say straight away, I'm not in any way trying to heap pressure here on Stuart Hyde. He's had quite enough. So I'm just talking about this in terms of trying to answer your question about why I did what I did. And why I did what I did was because the evidence I saw caused me to believe that there were cases to answer.
Listeners who've contacted BBC Radio Cumbria have suggested that you've been hypocritical after having to deal with your own expenses scandal whilst in post. What would you say to those people who are listening today?
These are two very different cases. In terms of your words, expenses scandal, I admitted that was a mistake. I came clean on that. My investigation by the Police and Crime Panel, and indeed my reply to Mr. Keith Vaz to the Parliamentary Select Committee, are well known and are publicised. That was a mistake. It was a one-off mistake. We're talking about something here which is very different.
I want to move on briefly to your handling of the situation. It's taken till today, almost a week after your announcements, to speak publicly about the county's chief constable and your decisions. Do you think that's the correct way to conduct your office, considering you were voted into place by the people of Cumbria, who've had to wait a very long time for an answer, not just a week, in actual fact almost a year?
Well, they haven't had to wait for just about a year to get an answer from me. But yes, I was not rushing to the studio last week to explain what was happening, certainly. The reason for that is that I think everybody will understand that there are times when you have to take a much more measured approach. And it's inappropriate to actually come out in public and say some things in order to allow the process to continue in an unhindered fashion. I was required by legislation to take a decision 4 weeks from the last one on the 29th of July. That had to be done last week. The process we went through last week was a difficult process. It was not, in my judgment, time to come out in public. And in any case, because at that stage we were still discussing legal affairs and legal implications as to what I was doing, I was advised by legal authority, by my solicitor, that I should not speak in public until such time, if you like, the air being cleared. That was done this morning. I'm here straight away.
On that note, your legal advice, the investigations, your legal advice, police officers' wages, Stuart Hyde's salary, it all amounts to near enough £500,000. Do you think the taxpayer has been given value for money?
I could not possibly support the idea that the taxpayer in this case had got value for money. It's a huge amount of money. I've already had conversations with the Minister for Policing, Damien Green, and told him that I will be giving him the benefit of my thoughts as a result of this process, because clearly members of the public, quite rightly, see this as a nonsense. It's gone on for far too long, it's all too expensive, and there has to be a better way. Now, the Minister has already been in the House of Commons and talked about facilitating disciplinary action against police officers and making sure there's a quicker process. I'm saying to him, it's time we developed a better process for chief constables. Now, that will include, in my judgment, that should include a limit on the finances spent. I think it should include greater involvement of the IPCC. And I would also like to suggest that it might include lay people, because in the health service and other sectors, we see lay people involved in inquiries, and I think that wouldn't be a bad idea.
Of the £500,000 that's been spent mainly by, well, I suppose about half of it was by your office, will any of it be paid back?
Well, let me say straight away that the figure you're quoting includes money that was spent prior to my election.
At least £160,000 of it, though, is your legal advice, isn't
yes. That's right. But the process was started beforehand. I took a decision to continue the process. I still think that was correct. still think that was correct. And it becomes very difficult when you're in that process to stop the expenditure, if you like, particularly when, in a sense, every month I got legal advice, and in the last few weeks I've had much more as to how to deal with this. Because actually I would suggest to you that if the Office of the Police and Crime Commissioner in Cumbria had got this wrong, then the potential bill in the courts will be significantly higher than it already has been.
The feedback we've had here from listeners, it hasn't been very positive when we've asked them about you and the handling of the situation. Many people have suggested that the way you've dealt with it warrants your resignation.
I'm very sorry if they feel that. Clearly, it's a matter of regret to me. But all I can say is I urge people to read the report, to look at the small print, and then make a judgment. And a lot of people didn't do that. May I say, we even had a case of a journalist ringing up, and when we asked, have you read the report, there was a long silence.
Do you think after all of this you'll be re-elected?
I don't know. There is plenty to be done. There's a huge amount of positive work going on at the moment. We've set up the Public Engagement Office. That's 40 public meetings we've had already. We've got the Victim Support Conference with Baroness Newlove, and if you like to start.
But really, when you say the name Richard Rhodes, your expenses and the name Stuart Hyde come to mind.
Inevitably. And if you say that, they say, don't they, that a politician is only remembered for one thing?
What do you think that's going to be in your case?
I'll leave you to judge that, Emma.
Richard Rhodes, thank you very much for joining us in the studio this evening. That's the